The first snow of November 2006 had come early to Whitefish, drifting down in slow, unhurried flakes that clung to the quiet back roads and muffled the world beneath a soft white hush. And in that hush, before anyone knew, her name would soon be spoken in news broadcasts and whispered in grocery store aisles. Lena Holloway moved through her final days with a kind of gentle, private ache she never shared with anyone. She was 27, a night shift nurse who preferred the anonymity of dim hallways and the rhythmic beeping of machines to the bright chatter of daytime life. Those who worked beside her described her as steady, meticulous, the kind of person who could hold a trembling patient's hand at 3 a.m. without once letting her own exhaustion show. She lived simply in a small cabin near the tree line east of Whitefish Lake, where the mornings came in pale blue light and the evenings arrived dressed in silence. Yet beneath the calm she carried around like a second skin, there was something else. Something she'd never quite managed to shake. A quiet loneliness that came not from isolation, but from living a life that always felt one step removed from the one she'd hoped to build. She kept memories tucked away like folded letters. Her father's voice from years ago, urging her to be careful with how much of herself she gave to others. The love she once felt for a man who left without ceremony. The lingering fear that her days were passing untouched by anything that truly belonged to her. Most people didn't see the internal world she guarded so carefully. They saw the precision, the professionalism, the faint smile she offered when coworkers wished her a good night. But when Lena drove home along the winding road toward her cabin, headlights slicing through tall pines, her thoughts drifted into places she never allowed aloud. The sense that something in her life was slipping just beyond her reach. That she was always bracing for something, though she couldn't say what. On those drives, the forest pressed close, branches bending with winter's slow approach. And sometimes she felt as if the dark was listening, watching, waiting. She tried to ignore it, telling herself it was only the exhaustion of back-to-back shifts, only the season drawing in around her. But even in daylight, the feeling lingered like the echo of a presence she couldn't quite name Dot in the days before her disappearance. The atmosphere around her seemed to thicken. She began waking before her alarm, heart pounding, sheets twisted as though she'd been fighting something in her sleep. She double-checked her locks more often. She told no one. She'd never been good at asking for help. Even when she needed it, Dot, her closest friend at the hospital, remembered later that Lena had seemed distracted that last week, her eyes drifting toward windows as if she were listening for something only she could hear. She'd brushed off the concern with a tired shake of her head, saying only that the cold always made her feel restless. But the truth was more fragile. She'd felt a deep, unexplainable unease, a tightening in her chest each time she stepped outside into the frigid air. Whitefish in 2006 was the kind of place where winter felt like a weight that settled on everyone. A quiet mountain town where nothing truly terrible was expected to happen, where people trusted the land, trusted their neighbors, trusted the long roads that stretched toward the horizon. But trust can be a delicate thing. And that year, something beneath the surface of the town had begun to shift. Lena sensed it before anyone else did. She felt it in the stillness of her cabin, in the way the wind pressed against the windows at night, in the fleeting moments when she'd catch her own reflection in the hospital's darkened glass and barely recognize the tired woman looking back. She had no way of knowing that these were the last nights she would ever drive home under the dim glow of Montana's winter sky. No way of knowing that soon her small cabin would sit untouched, its porch light flickering over a world that had already begun to forget the warmth of her presence. No way of knowing that the life she'd worked so hard to hold together, the routines, the sacrifices, the small moments of quiet resilience, was about to dissolve into a mystery that would haunt the town for years. But on those final evenings, in the drifting snow and the cold that seeped through the seams of her coat, Lena felt something closing in. Something she didn't have the words for. Something she couldn't escape. The story of what happened to her begins here, in the fragile space between who she was and who she never got the chance to become. On the nights when she felt the edges of her life trembling, and no one was watching closely enough to see it. Where are you watching from tonight? And what time is it there? In the weeks before everything broke open, Lena Holloway's life unfolded with the quiet discipline she'd carried since childhood, a rhythm built from small rituals, steady routines, and the fragile comfort she clung to more tightly than anyone realized. Most mornings found her arriving home just as the sky softened from black to muted gray. She'd park her car beneath the overhang beside the cabin, sit for a moment with her hands resting on the steering wheel, and feel the ache of the night shift linger in her bones. Then she'd gather herself slowly, deliberately, and step out into the brittle Montana air. Her boots crunched through frost. The wind curled around her like a thin, observant animal. The cabin stood quiet, as if holding its breath for her return. Inside, everything was arranged with careful precision. Folded blankets on the couch, books stacked by the wood stove, her grandmother's quilt draped over the bed with corners aligned just so. It wasn't perfection she was after, but control, something solid. Something she could order in a world that often felt too large, too loose, too unpredictable. Her life hadn't always been defined by solitude. There had been years when she'd imagined a different path. A small home filled with noise and warmth. The easy closeness of someone who understood the way her mind tangled itself in worry. But those hopes had dimmed quietly over time, worn down by a broken relationship and by the long, grueling nights at the hospital that left little room for anything tender. Still, Lena carried her dreams like small embers, hidden but never fully extinguished. She kept a sketchbook tucked beneath her bed, pages filled with charcoal drawings of mountains, quiet lakes, and imagined places where she might someday rest. She rarely showed them to anyone, maybe out of fear they'd be misunderstood. Maybe because she felt those dreams belonged to a version of herself she wasn't sure she deserved. Her emotional world was deeper, more intricate than the surface she offered. She missed her mother in sharp, unexpected waves, especially on mornings when the air smelled like pine the way it had during childhood camping trips. She worried about her younger brother, who lived 2 towns over and never quite managed to keep his life steady. She felt the distance grow between her and her father, a man who loved her in a quiet, stern way but struggled to understand the weight she carried alone. Coworkers saw her reliability. Family saw her resilience. But no one saw the nights she lay awake feeling an emptiness she couldn't name, or the afternoons she stood at the edge of her porch with a mug in her hands, staring at the tree line and wondering if she built a life that had room for her own heart. Even her work, so steady, so essential, held emotional currents no one else recognized. She loved her patients with a tenderness she never admitted to. She remembered their stories, their fears, the way some clung to her hand as though she alone could anchor them to this world. But she also carried the guilt of every loss, the ones she couldn't save, the ones who slipped away in the quiet hours, when monitors beeped faintly under the hospital's dim lights. Those memories lived inside her like small ghosts. Her routines offered a kind of fragile safety. After returning from a shift, she'd shower, make tea with honey, and sit by the wood stove while the cabin warmed around her. She wrote brief notes in a small leather journal, observations, fragments of thought, single sentences that felt easier than anything longer. Words like, "I keep feeling like something is missing. The woods are so loud at night. I wish I knew how to let people in." And occasionally, softer lines, "I want to feel understood." Her coworkers sometimes joked that she lived like an old soul, but they didn't understand that loneliness wasn't a condition. It was a landscape, one she navigated quietly every day. Yet it wasn't all sorrow. Lena carried gentleness too. She left small notes for the morning nurses when she finished her shift. She brought soup to an elderly neighbor during the early winter storm. She volunteered extra hours without complaint. She cared deeply, almost too deeply, for a world that rarely gave back the same tenderness. But underneath, a slow tension had been building. She felt watched sometimes, not by a person, but by the weight of the world pressing in. She felt stretched thin, caught between the life she lived and the life she longed for, unable to bridge the distance. She felt the ache of wanting connection, but fearing the vulnerability it required. Those who knew her best would later confess. They had sensed something was wrong, but never understood the depth of her struggle. Lena was too good at hiding it, too practiced at folding herself into quiet spaces where her pain couldn't inconvenience anyone. By late October, the emotional strain had become so constant she barely noticed it anymore. She moved through her days with an extra layer of stillness, a kind of held breath. And though she couldn't explain it, she felt as if something in her life was tilting subtly, steadily toward a place she couldn't control. The people around her would remember her final weeks as ordinary, uneventful, routine. But emotional landscapes rarely leave visible footprints. And inside Lena, something fragile was already beginning to fray. In the final days before Lena Holloway vanished, the rhythms of her life began to twist in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Her routines remained intact, outwardly flawless, but beneath the surface, the careful balance she had maintained for years began to falter. She arrived at the hospital each night, clocking in with the same meticulous care, checking her equipment, reviewing patient charts. Her colleagues noticed only small signs, a tremor in her hand while holding a clipboard, a distant gaze while listening to someone speak. She smiled when spoken to, but it was a tight, measured smile, as though she were performing a role rather than inhabiting her own life. Back at the cabin, the winter wind had begun its relentless return, rattling the windows and carrying with it the scent of damp pine and the distant lake. Lena would sit by the wood stove longer than usual, tracing the rim of her mug with her fingertip, her thoughts drifting into corners of the past she rarely visited. Childhood winters with her father and brother, the faint echo of her mother's laughter, moments of tenderness she had long buried. These memories, once comforting, now pressed on her chest with a weight she couldn't shake. Sleep, which had always been a refuge, became uneven and fragmented. She woke in the early hours, heart pounding, shadows from the trees casting dark fingers across her walls. Sometimes she thought she heard a soft creak outside, a footstep along the gravel path leading to her cabin. The wind, she told herself, was playing tricks. But the unease persisted. Even during daylight hours, a subtle tension threaded through her movements. She locked the door twice before leaving. She double-checked the stove. She peered out the window at the looming tree line, imagining shapes that might not exist. Her conversations at work became slightly shorter, her laughter a bit more brittle. Friends noticed she was quieter, and although she brushed off their concern with a faint shrug, she carried a growing sense of apprehension. There was a nervous rhythm to her movements, a hesitation at thresholds, as if she were weighing each step, each decision, against some unseen danger. Even the small joys she normally allowed herself, the quiet satisfaction of a perfectly folded sheet, the warmth of a steaming mug cradled in her hands, the hum of a hospital corridor in the dead of night now carried an edge, a lingering sense that something was off. Lena's emotional world had become a series of subtle alarms, a network of tensions she could neither name nor escape. And yet, life pressed on. Patients needed her steady presence. Colleagues relied on her calm. Friends expected her company. The mountains outside her cabin stood indifferent, silent witnesses to her internal disquiet. She moved through these final days with the grace of someone carrying a secret burden, aware of its weight but unwilling to expose it. The last weekend before she disappeared was particularly quiet in Whitefish. Snow fell steadily, blanketing the roads, softening the edges of the town. Lena stayed indoors for most of the day, reading, making tea, tending to small tasks around the cabin. The isolation, once comforting, now felt like a barrier. Even as she performed her routines with her usual care, there was an undercurrent of restlessness, a sense that the walls were closing in. On the evening before her final shift, she sat at the window, notebook in hand, sketching the trees that lined the edge of her property. Each line was deliberate, careful, yet even her drawings seemed tinged with unease. Shadows lengthened in the cabin as dusk fell, and the soft ticking of the clock grew louder in the quiet room. Lena's hand trembled slightly, though she tried to steady it. She paused, staring at the darkening woods, feeling a deep, nameless anxiety curling in her chest. The night of her last shift was cold and clear. Frost glinted under the streetlights as she drove toward the hospital. Inside, the familiar hum of machines and the quiet cadence of nurses' footsteps offered a semblance of normalcy. Yet even there, she could not shake the feeling that something unseen lingered just out of sight. By the time she finished her shift and drove back toward the cabin, the town was draped in an icy silence. The wind rattled the trees, and the snow muffled the road beneath her tires. She was careful, as always, glancing in the rearview mirror more often than necessary, checking the cabin's approach before pulling into the driveway. In those last hours, Lena's life held all the hallmarks of ordinary continuity: a steady job, a quiet home, the trust of those around her. But beneath that exterior, the threads of her life had begun to fray, the tension mounting in ways invisible to the casual observer. It was a quiet collapse, a slow burn that only she could feel, and for reason no one would understand until much later. The world she knew, the routines, the safety, the predictability of her life was about to rupture. The delicate balance she had maintained for decades was on the verge of shattering entirely, leaving only a void that would haunt Whitefish for years to come. And if stories like this keep you pulled in, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss what comes next. The night Lena Holloway disappeared was quiet, too quiet, as though the town of Whitefish itself had been holding its breath. The streetlights cast long, pale pools on the snow, the edges blurred by the drifting flakes. Her car, small and familiar, traced the winding road toward her cabin with a steady, cautious rhythm. Inside, she was alert yet weary, the tension in her chest an almost physical presence, pressing against her ribs with every careful turn of the wheel. The forest pressed in on both sides, dark and still, the skeletal branches scratching against the windows. The silence was broken only by the faint crunch of snow beneath the tires and the distant whisper of wind through the pines. Lena had driven this road countless times, yet that night it seemed different, ominous, alive with shadows that moved just beyond the reach of her headlights. She told herself it was the wind, the early Montana winter playing tricks on her mind. But even as she reassured herself, a slow, instinctive dread coiled tighter in her stomach. When she reached the cabin, she performed her usual routines almost mechanically, unlocking the door, flicking on the small overhead light, letting her coat hang in the hallway. Everything was in its place, the world familiar and orderly. Yet there was a tremor in her hands as she set down her keys. And for the first time she noticed how the wind bent the trees, how the snow seemed to press closer to the house, as though it carried the weight of something unseen. Inside, the warmth of the cabin was immediate but not comforting. She moved through the space with the precision of habit, lighting the stove, setting her tea to steep, and opening her journal to the page she had last written in. Her fingers lingered over the paper, tracing the charcoal lines of her sketches, the images of mountains and trees that had once felt like escape. now heavy with foreboding. Minutes stretched into an uneasy hour. Lena could hear the soft hiss of the stove, the occasional pop of burning wood, and the wind tapping against the windows. The solitude, usually a balm, now carried a weight she could not shake. Somewhere deep within, a flicker of alarm began to flare, unbidden and irrational, yet undeniable. Then came the moment when the quiet fractured. Perhaps it was the faint sound of his step on the porch, or the subtle shift in the wind that made the cabin feel suddenly exposed. Perhaps it was the echo of her own pulse in the stillness, the awareness that she was alone, utterly unprotected. Her body tensed, every muscle alert, as if anticipating something she could not yet name. Fear, subtle but insistent, began to creep along her spine. She moved through the cabin, checking doors, windows, locks, an instinctive ritual to reclaim some measure of control. But the shadows seemed heavier, the darkness deeper, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of her unease and were now closing in. By the time she stepped outside for a moment, wrapped in her coat and gloves, the wind had grown sharper, biting at exposed skin. She surveyed the tree line, the snow-covered path, the dim outline of her car. The world was silent, yet each small sound, an animal moving through the underbrush, the distant creak of a branch felt amplified, threatening. She took a deep breath, willing herself to return inside, to close the door against the cold and the fear. But the outside had a gravity all its own, a pull she could not fully resist. Lena's careful, measured world, the routines, the safety of her cabin, the predictable comfort of isolation, was about to rupture. In that moment, she was acutely aware of how thin the barrier was between her ordinary life and something unknowable, something capable of tearing her world apart. What followed would leave no witnesses. The night absorbed her presence, the snow blanketing every trace, the wind erasing footprints almost as soon as they appeared. Her car remained, the cabin silent, the lights casting long shadows over spaces that would soon be haunted by absence. A life meticulously constructed, full of tenderness and unspoken longings, had been interrupted with sudden, incomprehensible force. When Lena did not return to work, her absence first drew mild concern, then growing alarm. Colleagues called her home. No one answered. Friends drove to her cabin. The front door was locked, the stove cold, her sketches untouched. The immediate, instinctive dread that she had once felt alone in the dark now became a collective fear, a gnawing certainty that something had gone terribly wrong. The collapse of normalcy was sudden and complete. A life defined by careful routines, emotional labor, and quiet hope had been shattered in a single night, leaving behind only questions, silence, and a presence felt most acutely in its absence. The town of Whitefish would remember that night for decades, the snow, the cold, the oppressive quiet, and the knowledge that one of their own had disappeared into a world no one could see. And somewhere in the trees, in the wind, the unspoken dread lingered, as if the forest itself had witnessed the unraveling and kept its secrets close. The morning after Lena Holloway's disappearance, the town of Whitefish began to stir into a quiet panic. The streets, still frosted with snow, seemed smaller, narrower, as though the absence of one life had shifted the weight of the world. At the hospital, colleagues gathered in hushed corners, sharing fragments of concern and the uneasy certainty that Lena had not simply slept through a shift. Her car remained in the driveway of her cabin, untouched, the frost thick across its roof, the windows opaque with ice. The silence was palpable, pressing against everyone who had known her, a suffocating reminder of what had vanished. Her family was first to feel the emotional rupture. Her father, usually steady and composed, moved through his home with restless agitation, pacing floors, making phone call after phone call, his voice tight with fear. Her mother clutched the phone as if it were a lifeline, scanning news reports for anything that might hint at her daughter's whereabouts. Her younger brother sat in stunned disbelief, replaying their last conversation, questioning if he'd missed some sign, some whisper of distress that might have warned him. Each room, each chair, each corner of their shared memories became heavy with anticipation and dread. The initial investigation was methodical, but the emotional toll was immediate. Officers walked the snow-dusted roads, flashlights cutting arcs of light across pine needles, their radios crackling faintly in the cold air. The cabin was examined. Nothing forcibly disturbed, no sign of struggle beyond the intangible evidence of absence. They collected Lena's belongings, traced her last known movements, and spoke to neighbors who had noticed little but sensed the shift in the wind, the subtle tension of the woods around her home. The town's collective unease deepened with every passing hour. Whitefish was a place where doors were rarely locked, where neighbors trusted one another, where a missing person was almost inconceivable. The realization that Lena Holloway could vanish without immediate explanation fractured that trust. Conversations in grocery aisles, in coffee shops, even along snow-laden sidewalks were laced with worry. Everyone knew her. Everyone respected her. Yet no one could reconcile her absence with the ordinary flow of daily life. Investigators traced her movements from the hospital that night to the cabin, piecing together fragments of her final hours. Security footage, phone records, vehicle trajectories all formed a pattern that offered certainty in only one aspect. She had been alone on that drive home. Beyond that, the trail grew thin, intangible, almost impossibly delicate. The meticulous care she had exercised in her daily life left no mistakes, no trails, no clues. It was as if she had dissolved into the landscape itself. The psychological strain on Lena's family intensified with every unanswered question. Her father's gaze often drifted to the empty chair by the kitchen table. Her mother's phone remained in her hand long past the hour when she should have slept. Her brother walked the streets at night, searching not for footprints in the snow, but for a hint, a sign, anything that could restore the life that had abruptly vanished. Each unanswered ring, each unreturned call, compounded the weight of helplessness thought for the townspeople. The absence was a silent, unrelenting force. Snowflakes fell, and the roads remained empty in ways that felt unnatural. The hospital's night shifts continued, yet those long, quiet halls seemed haunted by the memory of someone who had been a presence both vital and unassuming. Conversations between nurses took on an edge of caution, a quiet acknowledgement of vulnerability, as if Lena's disappearance had quietly rewritten the rules of their world. Then came the first signs, tiny, almost invisible cracks in the mystery. A neighbor recalled seeing a shadow moving near the edge of the tree line the night she disappeared. A small object, barely distinguishable, was found near the cabin, a scarf caught in the snow. Faint traces of footprints leading nowhere. Investigators collected evidence meticulously, documenting everything with a thoroughness that underscored both the gravity and the uncertainty of the situation. As the investigation unfolded, the emotional tension in Whitefish became almost tangible. Each discovery, each fragment, each unanswered question seemed to reverberate through the town, leaving its mark on everyone touched by Lena's absence. Even the wind through the pines, once comforting, now carried a whisper of dread, a sense that something fundamental had shifted. And yet, amid this tension, life continued to move forward, imperfectly and painfully. Patients still arrived at the hospital. Family members still tended their homes. Neighbors still shoveled driveways, all while the shadow of loss lingered over every interaction. Lena's absence had carved a hollow space in the town, one filled with fear, uncertainty, and the haunting possibility that the familiar world could unravel at any moment. If you want to know what investigators uncovered next, go ahead and like this video. The weeks turned into months and months into years, yet Lena Holloway's disappearance remained unresolved. Whitefish, Montana, a town that had prided itself on its quiet safety, carried the weight of her absence like a low hum beneath the surface of daily life. Streets remained familiar, yet subtly altered, each corner shadowed by memory, each pine tree at the edge of town a silent witness to the night that had swallowed her. The snow returned every winter, a reminder of fragility and the relentless passage of time, covering the earth with an indifferent hush. For Lena's family, the absence became an unending ache, a slow erosion of certainty. Her parents continued to scan local news and missing persons reports, their hope undimmed but threaded with desperation. Every unfamiliar car that passed their driveway, every unexpected knock at the door, sent tremors through their hearts. Her brother carried a guilt he could not name, replaying final conversations and wondering if some small oversight, some ignored instinct, had contributed to the tragedy. The unanswered questions multiplied like shadows, stretching across years, shaping their thoughts, reshaping the spaces she had once occupied. Her friends at the hospital felt the loss differently, but no less acutely. Shifts that had once been predictable, filled with routine and quiet camaraderie, now carried a tension they could not shake. Every patient's hand they held, every machine that beeped in the darkened corridors, seemed to echo with the memory of her steady presence, the empathy she had given so freely. Even years later, the smallest details, the tilt of a bed, the way the light struck a chart, brought her to mind with painful clarity. The investigation itself slowed to a crawl, as it does with many cold cases. Leads went cold, footprints in the snow faded, and potential witnesses either moved away or forgot what they had seen. The evidence that remained tiny, fragmentary, often ambiguous, was cataloged meticulously, stored in boxes and digital files. Reminders of a life interrupted and a town left grasping for answers. Detectives revisited the case with each new development, yet the trail was faint, the signs elusive. Every path examined returned to the same haunting void. In this vacuum, memories began to warp, guilt shaping recollections with the elasticity of grief. Neighbors remembered fleeting glimpses of Lena differently with each retelling. A silhouette at the cabin window, a figure moving through falling snow, a muffled sound in the night. Each memory carried emotional weight, a subtle suggestion of blame, a whispered possibility of what might have been done differently. The mind, left to process absence without closure, often finds ways to construct its own narratives, and in Whitefish, those narratives were heavy with fear and regret. The town itself changed in imperceptible ways. Streets became quieter, not only from the snow but from a subtle withdrawal, an instinctive caution that had not existed before. Parents warned children to remain close to home. Neighbors double-checked locks that had never needed securing. Lena's disappearance created a ripple that transformed the ordinary into the fragile, the predictable into the tentative. Whitefish's collective heartbeat had shifted, MESURED now by the pulse of memory and the ache of uncertainty. For those who had loved her, the emotional scars were intimate, relentless. Each holiday arrived as a test of endurance. Each birthday, each anniversary, marked by the hollow echo of absence. Her family, friends, and colleagues carried her memory not only in grief, but in the unspoken realization that they could not fully protect what they held most dear. There was guilt, yes, but also a stubborn refusal to relinquish hope, even as years hardened into a landscape of waiting and shadows. And yet, through the years, something persisted, a quiet vigilance. Those who remembered Lena, who had known her life and her gentleness, never allowed her memory to fade entirely. They scanned the horizon with unrelenting attention, listening for whispers in the wind, for the softest trace of a presence long gone. It was a vigilance born of love, of loss, of an unshakable human need for closure. If you could tell someone what really happened all those years ago, who would you speak to first? Nearly a decade after Lena Holloway disappeared, the fragile threads of her story began to pull taut once more. Cold cases have a way of lying dormant, like embers beneath ash, waiting for a gust to reignite them. In Whitefish, that gust came unexpectedly through a witness who had carried a memory for years, silent and fearful, waiting for the right moment to speak. The confession was quiet, hesitant, but it cracked open the carefully held silence that had surrounded Lena's disappearance. Long-buried truths surfaced slowly, like sunlight breaking through a winter storm. Details that had once seemed insignificant, an overheard argument, a stranger glimpse near the edge of town, a fleeting impression of movement in the woods, coalesced into a pattern that demanded attention. The investigators who had never stopped pursuing the case pored over these fragments, connecting lines that had lain dormant in notebooks, archived files, and fading memories. The story, once incomplete and fractured, began to take shape, revealing dimensions of fear and manipulation no one had anticipated. Family members felt a complex swell of emotions, relief that progress was finally being made, terror at the truths they were only beginning to grasp, sorrow for the years spent in uncertainty. Each revelation seemed to illuminate the fragility of the world Lena had inhabited, the dangers she had perhaps sensed but could not articulate. And the town, too, shifted under the weight of this newly revealed knowledge, its collective memory reorienting itself around the contours of fear, vulnerability, and the courage it had taken for someone to finally speak. The witness's account, delivered with tremulous conviction, described the last known moments of Lena's life. The narrative was intimate yet chilling. She had sensed the presence of danger, had felt it approach along the familiar roads she had always trusted. The small, protective habits she clung to, checking locks, scanning the tree line, pausing at the edge of her driveway, were rendered tragic in hindsight. Desperate measures against forces she could not fully understand. For investigators, for family, for the town, the account provided both clarity and an unbearable weight of empathy. Detectives revisited the cabin, retracing steps through snow that had long melted, examining walls, floors, and furniture with a renewed scrutiny. The evidence, once cold and inert, was now reframed in light of the witness's recollections. Tiny details, a mark on a doorframe, a dislodged floorboard, a faint trace in the snow, took on new significance. Patterns emerged where none had been visible before. And slowly, painstakingly, the outline of the events that had claimed Lena's life began to crystallize. The breakthrough did not erase the years of silence and uncertainty. It compounded them with clarity. Every unanswered question of the past was now partially illuminated, leaving a trail of raw emotional resonance. Those who had loved Lena most intimately felt both relief and renewed anguish, the knowledge that she had been in danger, the realization of her courage, and the painful understanding of how alone she had been in her final hours. And yet, in the midst of revelation, there was a fragile catharsis. The truth allowed grief to articulate itself in new ways. Memories, once twisted by uncertainty and guilt, could now be reframed with the sharp edges of understanding. The town, though marked by trauma, began to reckon with its collective responsibility, with the need to preserve the memory of a life that had been abruptly torn away. Someone spoke the words that had been unsaid for years. They were not loud, not triumphant, but intimate and necessary. Lena Holloway had not simply vanished. Her life had been taken, and the circumstances surrounding her disappearance had been hidden in the quiet spaces of fear and secrecy. The admission, small and tremulous, shifted the emotional landscape for everyone who had held her memory, allowing the first glimmer of closure to reach the edges of grief. The town exhaled collectively, a muted, uneven release of breath that carried the weight of the past decade. Lena's family, her friends, and the community that had waited and feared and remembered could now confront the contours of truth, however painful. And in the slow, careful reckoning, the question lingered. echoing softly. If one could finally speak the truths long buried, who would they tell first? The revelation of Lena Holloway's fate rippled through Whitefish like a sudden thaw breaking winter ice. The truth, once buried beneath layers of snow, uncertainty, and fear, now cut sharply through years of silence. Her family absorbed it in fragments, each detail a jagged shard that both illuminated and deepened their grief. The house that had been empty for so long felt suddenly heavier, as if her presence lingered not in memory alone, but in the very walls that had once contained her life. Investigators worked with renewed urgency, guided by the long-suppressed accounts that had finally emerged. Every trace, every overlooked fragment of evidence was revisited, catalogued, and reinterpreted. The forest bordering Lena's cabin was combed carefully, each step deliberate, each shadow considered. Photographs from the scene, faint imprints in the snow, subtle anomalies in witness statements, all began to converge into a coherent narrative that had eluded the town for nearly a decade. For her family, the truth was both a relief and a torment. The ambiguity that had haunted their nights and shadowed their days was replaced by understanding, yet understanding brought with it a relentless weight. Her parents wandered the quiet spaces of their home, noting details they had previously overlooked: the slight tilt of a picture frame, the scuff on a floorboard, the way her mug had been left on the counter. Every small artifact became a portal into memory, each one whispering of the life that had been taken. Friends, too, confronted the contours of reality in a new, sharper light. The hospital corridors, once a place of routine and shared care, were infused with remembrance tinged by horror. Colleagues traced their steps back to the nights they had seen her last, replaying conversations and observing the smallest, previously unnoticed gestures, a glance, a sigh, the way she adjusted her coat before heading out into the cold Montana night. Each memory now carried a fresh emotional weight, a mixture of admiration, sorrow, and guilt. The town felt the shift as well. Whitefish, quiet and stoic, had long absorbed Lena's absence with the fragile resilience of small communities, confronting the incomprehensible. Now, with the truth in hand, the emotional landscape transformed. There was grief, yes, but also a recognition of courage, of the resilience required to survive years of uncertainty, while carrying the memory of someone who had been lost. The forest and roads around the town, long symbols of quiet menace and mystery, became spaces of reflection, reminders of the fragility of ordinary life. Every revelation brought clarity, yet clarity was never easy. The psychological landscape of the town, of Lena's family, of those who had loved her, shifted unevenly. Anger mingled with relief. Sorrow mingled with a tentative, fragile sense of closure. The threads of memory, stretched taut by years of uncertainty, slowly began to weave themselves into a fabric of understanding. Yet even as details emerged who had been involved, how events had unfolded, the emotional residue of nearly a decade of not knowing remained, subtle but unyielding. Lena's cabin, once simply a home, now became a locus of reflection. The familiar spaces, the wood stove, the journals, the sketches of distant mountains spoke to her internal world with renewed poignancy. Every object, every detail, was a testament to her meticulous, sensitive nature, a glimpse into a life defined by empathy and quiet courage. For those who had mourned in silence, seeing these remnants grounded their grief, gave it shape, and allowed it to transform into remembrance, thought through the painstaking uncovering of truth. The town began to reconcile with the emotional void left by her disappearance. The knowledge of what had occurred allowed collective memory to anchor itself in reality, rather than speculation. And in that anchor, painful as it was, came the faintest hint of healing, a chance to honor her life, to acknowledge her bravery, and to recognize the human cost of fear, secrecy, and the fragility of safety. By the time the investigation concluded its initial stages, the contours of the past had been laid bare. Lena Holloway's life, her final moments, and the darkness that had intruded upon her existence were no longer suspended in ambiguity. The truth, though devastating, allowed the town, her family, and her friends to face what had happened with open eyes, to place grief alongside understanding, and to begin the slow process of integrating loss into memory. The final unraveling of Lena Holloway's story arrived not in a single moment, but as a slow, deliberate succession of revelations. Years of uncertainty, compounded by absence and the unrelenting weight of speculation, gave way to a narrative both precise and harrowing. Each new fact, each corroborated memory, layered itself onto the emotional landscape of Whitefish, creating a tapestry woven from grief, understanding, and the long shadow of fear. Her family bore the brunt of the emotional crescendo. Every conversation, every revisit to the cabin, every image of Lena, whether a photograph on a mantle or a note tucked into a drawer, was suffused with the resonance of clarity. The details that had haunted them for nearly a decade now carried sharpness, the final trajectory of her movements, the subtle indicators that something had been amiss, the presence of forces she had sensed but could not articulate. Each truth cut like winter air through exposed skin, but in that cutting lay the possibility of resolution. Whitefish itself felt the tremor of understanding ripple outward. Roads that had been walked in trepidation, streets once familiar and safe, now bore the weight of acknowledgement. People who had watched Lena move through the town remembered her with renewed depth, the careful precision of her steps, the empathy in her eyes, the quiet attentiveness she had given to both patients and neighbors. The town's collective memory adjusted, accommodating grief alongside the long-awaited clarity that allowed their imaginations to finally rest. Investigators pieced together the culmination of events with painstaking care. Every fragment of evidence, footprints long faded, subtle marks in the snow, the faint disarray of her cabin was recontextualized, forming a coherent chain that traced her last hours. The narrative revealed not only the mechanics of her disappearance, but also the fragile courage with which she had navigated the final moments of her life. Fear had been present, palpable, and unspoken. Yet she had acted with clarity and intention. The instinct to survive threaded through her final decisions. Emotionally, the town experienced a collective catharsis. The long-standing tension of not knowing began to give way to acknowledgement. The patterns of fear, suspicion, and whispered conjecture were replaced with deliberate remembrance and quiet mourning. It was not joy that filled the spaces left by years of absence, but a profound and sober recognition. Lena's life had mattered. Her existence had been full, and her absence had left a void that would remain, but one now defined by truth rather than speculation. Her family, though fractured by grief, found moments of reconciliation with the past. Conversations once impossible were now grounded in knowledge. The unbearable questions, where, why, how, were answered, at least in part, allowing the raw edges of uncertainty to soften. Memories of her daily routines, her laughter, her meticulous care, and the quiet moments she had shared with loved ones gained clarity, forming an emotional archive that could be revisited with comprehension rather than anguish. Colleagues and friends experienced a similar transformation. They could finally acknowledge the depth of her presence, the impact she had had on their lives, and the profound human loss that had gone unarticulated for so many years. Every hallway, every hospital room, every quiet night shift became a vessel for remembrance, a place to honor the consistency and compassion that had defined her life. The culmination of the investigation and the surfacing of truth did not erase pain, nor did it return what was lost, but it allowed grief to be tethered to reality, to settle into spaces where it could exist without consuming the imagination. The town, the family, the friends each had the opportunity to navigate the contours of loss with the knowledge that the mystery had finally been pierced, that the shadow that had lingered over years had been illuminated, and that Lena Holloway's story, though tragically cut short, could be remembered fully, accurately, and with dignity. And as the snow fell quietly over Whitefish, as the wind whispered through the pine trees near her cabin, a fragile peace settled over the spaces she had once filled. Her memory endured not as a puzzle, but as a testament to life, resilience, and the delicate human capacity to hold both grief and understanding in a single breath. In the stillness that followed the final unraveling, Whitefish, Montana, carried the weight of Lena Holloway's life in quiet, enduring ways. The snow fell in measured silence, blanketing the roads and the edges of the forest where her cabin had stood, as though the earth itself sought to honor her memory. Those who had loved her, the family who ached daily for her presence, the friends who remembered her gentle care, the colleagues who had shared countless night shifts, now moved through their lives with a mixture of sorrow and fragile clarity. The long years of uncertainty had finally been replaced with truth, and in that truth came both the sting of loss and the comfort of understanding that her family still felt the echoes of her absence in the spaces she once occupied. The kitchen chair she had sat in, the corner of the living room where she read her sketches, the faint impressions of her steps on the cabin's warm floors, all remained silent witnesses to a life that had been abruptly, irrevocably interrupted. Yet these same spaces became portals into memory, tangible connections to the daughter, sister, and friend who had left an indelible mark on those around her. Every object, every trace, carried the intimacy of someone known deeply, loved quietly, and mourned profoundly. The town, too, had been reshaped by the years of waiting and the eventual revelation. Streets, buildings, and familiar landscapes bore witness to the shared grief, the collective vigilance, and the deep human need for resolution. The hospital corridors, where she had moved with quiet precision and empathy, retained the ghost of her presence, not as a haunting but as a reminder of care given and lives touched. In classrooms, in coffee shops, and along snow-laden sidewalks, people remembered the way she had been a steady, reliable, compassionate presence, and let those memories inform the world they continued to inhabit. Emotionally, the community began to reconcile with the unspoken tension that had lingered for years. Grief, once raw and unending, transformed into remembrance. Sorrow became an act of recognition rather than a torment of uncertainty. Conversations that had been muted by fear could now include her name freely, spoken with reverence and affection, as a way of preserving the life that had been stolen too soon. Whitefish, in all its quiet resilience, held her memory with an awareness sharpened by the passage of time, by the pain of absence, and by the ultimate illumination of truth. For Lena's family, the emotional journey did not end, nor did it seek to erase the trauma of her loss. Rather, the knowledge of her final moments and the clarity of events allowed grief to find shape, to exist without the unrelenting ambiguity that had haunted them for nearly a decade. It permitted them to honor the depth of her life, to preserve her memory with dignity, and to integrate the experience into their own ongoing narratives of love, resilience, and endurance. And in the hushed spaces where she had once lived, a delicate peace settled not the end of grief, but the emergence of a different way of carrying it. Her journals, her sketches, her meticulous routines, and the quiet moments of her life all remained as enduring testaments to the person she had been. They were reminders that even amidst loss, human connection, courage, and tenderness can leave traces that persist, shaping memory and offering solace. The wind whispered through the pines. The snow glimmered in the fading light, and the forest seemed to exhale a slow acknowledgement of her life. Lena Holloway, though gone, was remembered fully, not only for the tragic circumstances of her disappearance, but for the quiet dignity, empathy, and resilience that had defined her days. In remembering her, Whitefish preserved not only a story of loss, but also a story of life. Human connection and the slow, aching beauty of memory carried through time. And when you're ready, click the video on the right to explore another case.